Hello and welcome. I'm Lucas Hergert, and I'd like to offer this class, Jesus as Political Radical. This is a follow-up to the class that I offered. We met on Zoom and had a 4-week session on it. And what I'm going to do here in this series is try to boil down some of the lecture and some of the concepts and make this available to anyone who would like to watch it, in part because I think this is a really important topic. I think it's a really good one and a relevant one for folks to be pondering. How was Jesus intervening in the political context in which he lived, and what does that tell us about struggles for justice and equality today? So a couple of things to kind of get us started here. What I'm going to do in this video is focus on the discussion about who the historical Jesus was, how we can know anything about this historical figure, what sources we have, how those sources are used, that sort of thing. I'll be moving on in the next video to talk more about the social context of the Roman Empire and to talk about the struggles for justice and equality in that particular context. And then in the 2 final videos, I will talk about Jesus's mission, and I have a very specific reason for separating that out into 2 different videos. I'm going to be relying a lot on Richard Horsley's book, Jesus and Empire, a book I highly recommend. And he breaks Jesus's missional work out into two different arms or branches. One of them being sort of prophetic condemnation or prophecy against the Roman Empire. Jesus's statements in which he is sort of calling out the powers that be. And then the other missional arm or branch is what he calls community or covenant renewal, which is really about how he was calling his followers and going into villages and proclaiming a very different way to be together socially. And I think both of those things have a lot to contribute to how we think about contemporary struggles for justice in our world. So that's the general frame. Let's see. So to begin, I think it's important that I address just the title of the class. So Jesus as political radical. I want to suggest that is, I think it's right, and I think we can talk about Jesus that way, but I do have to give a caveat about that, which is that the concept of the political as being separate from the theological or religious, that's a new one. It's a new concept. That's a post-Enlightenment concept that developed in the West, and it came out of some very specific things that were happening in Europe around the wars of religion, specifically in France, and that then expanded to other parts of Europe. And what was happening was that the religious conflict was so deep and so intense between Catholics and Protestants that people started to wonder, well, is there a way that we can just talk about having a political space in which we're all living, and then we can tolerate the sort of religious and theological differences that we have? That gave birth to this notion that the political and the theological or religious are separate spheres, and we can talk about them as distinct spheres. Now, I'm recording this video a couple of days after Roe v. Wade has been overturned. And so we might well question just the viability of that separation and how alive it is in our current social context. That's, I think that's an important question, and there's a lot of scholars that do that. But what I will say about that is that even though we can look at ways that, religion is inflecting political and judicial decisions today, we still very much have a concept of the political and a concept of the religious that are separate. Like, we still really rely on that conceptual distinction. That would not have been the case in Jesus's time. And so, in a way, the class title, Jesus as Political Radical, is a little bit misleading, because I'm not going to be arguing in this class that, we just really need to like peel away all the religious fluff and like get to, at sort of like Jesus as Karl Marx type situation. Like, that's not my that's not what I'm going to be doing, because that would be really alien to how Jesus understood the world and how Jesus understood his mission. His theological language is shot through with ideas about what a just order would be. His discussions of what a just order would be were always interlaced with understandings of what God's justice was, and language about the kingdom of God, and parables about the kingdom. I mean, there's just no way to try to pull those apart and have it make sense. Or if you did, you're going to end up with a really sort of truncated version of who this person, who Jesus as a person, might have been. So I will be very much holding those two together, and at the same time having us focus on the ways that his theological teachings, his religious message, had deep social and political implications for what a just order in the world would look like, and how we can intervene as political actors. Okay, so what do we know about Jesus? Like, what are the sources for talking about Jesus and thinking about Jesus? Well, I mean, just go back to, the Roman world, and like, Jesus is the Son of God, right? So, there's got to be like just tons of people writing about this and talking about this, and just, so many sources. It's just like, it's hard to like wade through them all, because, we just have this like, the pagans and Jewish people and Jesus's followers, they're all writing stuff down and just producing tons and tons of stuff. Yeah, not so much. One of the frustrating and challenging things about historical Jesus research is that there are not very many sources. If we just take the first century, we have one source that is not one of Jesus's followers. That source is Josephus. He was a Jewish historian, a Hellenized Jewish historian, living in about, I think he was writing in the 90s. So if you just think about that, that would be a lot like me trying to write a book about Eisenhower simply through word of mouth stuff that people had told me and sort of passed down orally, like through generations. So it's a question about how reliable that source even is. But nonetheless, he wrote a book called The History of the Jews, and in it he has a paragraph not a chapter. It's not a whole book. It's a paragraph about Jesus and his followers. And it basically, it says very little. It just says that, there was this man and, he's called the Christ, and people, he had followers and he was crucified. Now, if you try to pull this up online, you might get different versions, because in the class when I taught this, somebody grabbed a version of this from online and posted it in the chat, and we read it together, and it said something like, Jesus, the Son of God, who was, crucified and then was risen, and he had followers and da. So why that, we were all like, I was like, okay, this doesn't sound right, because Josephus is not a Christian. He's a Hellenized Jew, and so why would he be adding all that language to that paragraph? Well, the reason is because later people who had Josephus's writings embellished it as they were translating it, and they added, a lot of accolades to, the description of Jesus. So just so you know, if you go look for that, that's what you'll find. So we have that paragraph, and then what else do we have? We have the Gospels. The Gospels. We also have the letters, Paul's letters, the epistles. Those are important. And Paul did not know Jesus in person, so, and a lot of his understanding came from his own sort of personal spiritual interaction with Jesus. But nonetheless, Paul was writing fairly early, actually, earlier than when the Gospels were written down. He was writing his letters in the 50s. And so there are important bits that we can get out of that, particularly some of the concepts and teachings that Jesus had. Some of it's going to be very much like Paul's take. Well, all of it'll be Paul's take, but some will be more interpretive than other things that we might think are a bit more historical. So those are important. But then we have the Gospels, which attempt to recount the life of Jesus. Now, if we're looking at the Gospels, when were the Gospels written? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? Those are supposed to be Jesus's disciples. So written, right after Jesus's death, or, sometime after Jesus's death, by the people who are following him. Yeah, that's not what scholars think. Spoiler alert. And there's different reasons for this. So I'm going to put John aside. John is written the latest, and it is not considered one of the documents that people tend to go to for history. So people tend to go to Mark, Matthew, and Luke in order to have a more historical, to sort of peel back the layers of who the historical Jesus might be. John is considered too theologized, too spiritualized, and too late to have much insight into who the historical Jesus might have been. So let's take Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Mark was written in about 70 of the Common Era, and Matthew and Luke were written between 80 and 85 of the Common Era. So you think about that. Jesus died in about 30 of the Common Era. That's a significant amount of time between his death and his life finally being written down. So it was an oral culture, and people had an ability to know and memorize stories in ways that are less fathomable to us. And what we know from, sort of orality and oral culture is that oftentimes, stories, do change and develop, and they get embellished and things get taken away and all of that stuff. So, the documents are going to be complicated in terms of trying to sort out, what might be historical and what might not be. So how do we know that they were written later? There's lots of reasons, but I'll just give one. So in all three of those documents, Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple. What we know from Roman history is that the temple was destroyed. And it was destroyed because of a revolt that had happened in 70 of the Common Era. So if you are a devout believer, you might just say, well, Jesus knew. I mean, he just knew. He was the Son of God, right? How could he not know? If you're taking it from a more historical, critical perspective, you're going to think, well, probably this was written down after the temple was destroyed, and that's how they knew to say that Jesus was able to prophesy it. So that's one element that, gives us a clue that these might be written later if we're coming at it from this more, historical and less theological perspective. So Matthew and Luke are thought to be written later. And why might that be? Well, interestingly, it would seem that Matthew and Luke had access to Mark. And it would seem that they were able to lift significant portions of Mark pretty much verbatim and include that in their own gospel accounts. So this leads us to an interesting discussion of, what sources were these gospels using. So Matthew and Luke had access to Mark and were using bits and pieces of that. It also appears that they had access to another document, and we know that because they're using some lines that are almost verbatim that are not in Mark, which would imply that they had another gospel or another piece of source material, a collection of sayings that they were able to pull language from in order to write their own gospel. It then would also seem that they had access to independent sources that the two of them didn't share. So what are the sources then? Mark, this source that they share, and that source is given a name. It's Q, which is short for Quell, which in German just means source. People noticed this all the way back in the 1800s. Okay, so that source document is well known and thought about. It did not survive. I mean, we've never been able to locate it. It's been destroyed or lost to history. But so that's called Q, Mark Q. And then we have L, which is Luke's independent source, and M, which is Matthew's independent source. Let me see if I can pull this up for you in order to show you what this looks like. Okay. Hopefully you can see this here on my screen. This is called the four-source hypothesis. Now, are there other source hypotheses out there? Is there a five-source hypothesis? Is there a one-source hypothesis? Is there an 18? So I don't know about an 18, but yes, this is a debated discussion in biblical studies, and most biblical scholars go with the four-source hypothesis. And what you can see here is that Q is used by both Matthew and Luke. Mark is used by both Matthew and Luke. And then M is used by Matthew, L is used by Luke. Okay, I'm going to stop the share here. And so that is those are the sources, those are the central sources that we are going to be using in order to create a picture of who Jesus might have been and what his religious/political mission might be. Now, it's really interesting, I think, and Richard Horsley, who is a historical Jesus scholar, writing this book, Jesus and Empire, he's talking about, he relies very heavily on Mark and Q. Why might he be doing that? Well, those are earlier documents, right? If Matthew and Luke are relying on them for their own source, those are earlier documents. And, if you think about just what's probably going to be more reliable. I mean, there are other factors that go into this, but what's probably going to be more reliable is a source that is, chronologically closer to the actual event or actual person than a source that is later. So, relying on Mark and Q might provide us with a bit more accuracy in terms of what sort of things we're, locating and finding. Okay, I'm going to shift gears now and talk a little bit about historical Jesus research. And actually, I'm going to pause our recording for just a moment, and I'll be right back. Okay, so where was I? I wanted to make sure that I had the texts that I needed for this. So I want to talk a little bit about historical Jesus research and how that has developed. So people have been talking about the historical Jesus since at least the 1800s. But so there were multiple attempts to try to imagine, who the historical person might be. And, we can look at Thomas Jefferson, the Jefferson Bible, being one of those, not really using any kind of historical methodology, but rather just peeling away all of the miracles and supernatural elements from Jesus' story and just trying to produce, here's a document of what the teachings are, and, his sort of faith that is accurately captures what Jesus said. So in the late 1800s, you also had a movement called the Lives of Jesus. And this was very much not historical. Entertaining in many ways. You had people writing these sort of, dime store novels about before there were dime stores, whatever dime stores are, but basically writing these novels that were trying to sort of fill in the gaps of who Jesus was, and very, very creative. I mean, I know there's one that's, sort of Jesus as a huckster who is more or less like a stage magician. And so he stages these miracles and people, believe them. And then he fakes his own crucifixion, and it's all, for money and fame. And so, just kind of wild interpretations of who Jesus might be. But towards the end of the 1800s, you also got a group of scholars who were really trying to say, hey, based on, historical methodology, is there a way that we can take a look at the Gospels and try to locate like who this historical figure might have been? And they come up with some different criteria in order to do that. One criteria is the criterion of multiple attestation. And you might think about this, from the angle of how a court proceeding might go. You know, if you have somebody who is a witness who is the only person who saw something, that's going to be less reliable than a witness than multiple witnesses, right? Multiple attestation means that it's shown up in multiple places. So if a teaching, like say the kingdom of God, is one that Paul talks about in his letters, it shows up in Mark, and it also shows up in the Q sayings, then we probably have there's more reliability there that Jesus might have said it, right? Especially since those are independent of each other. Another criteria that came up at that point was the criterion of embarrassment. So what might embarrassment be? Well, if there is an episode that occurs in the Gospels that likely that later interpreters, Christian interpreters, had to go at lengths to try to explain, probably more likelihood that it was historical, right? Because why else would you insert that in there, right? Like if you're trying to get the wheat out from the chaff, and so you're basically going to say, if this thing would have been problematic for later writers, it's pretty unlikely that they would have invented it. So what's an example of that? Well, Jesus's baptism is a good example of that. You might well think like, well, if somebody's baptized, it may very well indicate that they're a follower of the person who's baptizing them, right? And that is not what the writers of the Gospels nor later Christian tradition want to emphasize about Jesus. They're not trying to create a movement that follows John the Baptist. They're trying to create a movement that follows Jesus. And so what do we find when we look at the Gospels? Well, immediately after Jesus is baptized, there's a voice that comes from the heavens that says, "This is my son in whom I am well pleased." Basically saying like, stop paying attention to John the Baptist, pay attention to Jesus. And hence the voice and that whole notion, that whole section of that instance, probably a later addition in order to counter the notion that Jesus may have been a follower of John the Baptist, right? Okay. So that is called what happened at the end of the 1800s and beginning of the 1900s. That's called the first quest for the historical Jesus. And it comes to a pretty abrupt end in I want to say like 1905 to 1910. It just disappears. It dissipates. There's a sort of feeling of like, well, I guess what needed to be said has been said. It's time to move on. There's a movement in theology that's really emerging that is pushing against the notion that historical Jesus research is valuable at all. That's represented well by this theologian named Rudolf Bultmann, who talks about Jesus's thatness. So it's what he means by that is that what's important about Jesus is not whether something is historical or whether it actually happened. What's important about Jesus is that Jesus existed, that Jesus died for our sins. And what we need to do is try to extrapolate a theology out of the fact that Jesus existed, not about whatever the particularities are. Those are not crucial. So, with that being kind of the dominant theological strand at that point, you can see why historical Jesus research sort of falls out of favor. Get to about the 1950s and you have a revival. Ernst Käsemann gives a lecture about the historical Jesus. He introduces some new criteria. One of his criteria is, I think it's called the criterion of like double dissimilarity, and basically what that means is a little bit like the criterion of embarrassment. But if you can show that something is both unlike how later Christian teachings present Jesus and unlike how Judaism would have understood and sort of the historical context that Jesus was in understood him, then it's more likely that it is historical. It's kind of the notion of like, wow, that was an odd thing to say. That was a really weird thing for somebody to say. And maybe because it's so weird, it is more historical. There's a lot of critique of that paradigm, of that criterion, but nonetheless, that's what he presented, and it excited people, that and some other things that he was presenting in terms of the research. And so there was this burst in the middle of the 20th century of historical Jesus research again. That then died down. And then in the 1980s, the third quest began, and the third quest is still underway. It has not ceased. The third quest is highly focused on the historical context of Jesus. In a way, it's reacting to and rejecting that criterion of double dissimilarity, because it says it's prejudice or bias or take is that if we can show something is more likely to have been historical in Jesus's particular context, then it's more likely that it will have that may have been something that Jesus did, which makes a lot of sense. Like, if somebody 100 years from now like quotes me speaking some language that I don't speak or something like that, like they're going to be like, no, like he was a 21st century American English speaker, like, so so same for Jesus, and not just about linguistic stuff. The linguistic stuff is really important, actually. Like there's one of the things that some scholars look for are turns of phrase that would have made sense in Aramaic, because that's what Jesus spoke. He spoke Aramaic. And if you can show that even though they're written down in Greek, because the Gospels were written in Greek, that the turn of phrase made sense in Aramaic, might be more historical. And that is something that's emerging from the third quest. Archaeology starts to play an important role. Archaeology is something that is just a sort of historically interesting thing, because it's not the first time that people have like discovered physical objects from Jesus's time, but it is the first time that those might be more historical, because in the Middle Ages, you had tons of people who were like, I have the cup that Jesus drank from, and I have a splinter from the cross. It just wasn't historical. Those were called relics. People put them in churches and would go, and miracles would happen around them. But this is looking at things that scholars are able to date, archaeologists are able to date from that time. There's, you might take a look at I won't get into it, but the boat from the sea, from the Galilee boat, the Sea of Galilee boat, which is like from 50 of the Common Era, so 2 decades after Jesus' death. And, Jesus was around that sea. He was on a boat at one point, in terms of one of the stories about him. And so, it's interesting to see what that boat might have looked like, and what fishermen might have been doing at that time. So anyway, I'm moving on from that. I don't, we won't spend time on archaeology. So let's see, what else? So that's basically the quests. Those are the quests of for the historical Jesus. Oh, in terms of the last thing I wanted to mention is that you might be familiar with some names from the third quest: Marcus Borg, John Dominic Crossan. Those are two names that have been popularized and that have made a crossover into sort of, New York Times bestseller like lists in terms of, historical Jesus research. N.T. Wright is another one. N.T. Wright has a bit more orthodox conservative view, but relies on historical Jesus research and talks a lot about it, and also critiques aspects of it. Marcus Borg, very liberal progressive Christian. John Dominic Crossan also leaning towards that more liberal side. All right, so that's the search for the historical Jesus, and those are the sources that they tend to be relying on. Again, archaeology, peeling through the Gospels. Some of it looking at the letters that Paul wrote, and that's what's giving us a sense of who this person might have been. The third quest, relying very heavily on the social context that Jesus was in, produced two things that are really important for our context of study and what we're doing in this class. One of them is that in sort of a post-Holocaust world, there is much more sensitivity to Jesus's Jewishness. And that's not only out of, this sort of like, oh, let's be politically correct, but out of the sense that, wow, like something was really missed and distorted with centuries of Christian interpretation that emphasized that Jesus was somehow trying to create a new religion and push against, his Jewish context. No, he understood himself as a Jew. He understood himself as teaching from the Hebrew scripture. Wasn't really Hebrew scripture at that point, but there were sacred writings. He understood himself as teaching from the sacred writings and teachings of Judaism. It's even in the Gospels. It's really pretty explicit. He says that not one iota will pass away from the law. My teachings are fulfilling the law, right? He understood himself, the stuff like helping somebody on the day of the, on the Sabbath. And he has an interaction with the Pharisees around that. And, they say, well, wait, like, you're not supposed to do anything on the Sabbath, like, don't help somebody. He understood himself as being a more faithful Jew by helping someone on the Sabbath, because he thought that the spirit of that law needed to serve it. The law was designed to serve human beings, so its interpretation and its spirit needs to serve human beings. And there might be instances in which you can more faithfully serve the Mosaic law or abide by the Mosaic law, the covenant, by not following it to the letter. But that made him more Jewish in his view, right? So that's really important to hold in this context. And then the other thing that the third quest, really produced, aside from that sensitivity, is a greater awareness of what was going on in the Roman Empire. And this is what the topic of my next video will be. So there had been some written about this But the sort of the brutality, the domination, the cruelty of that context had not really been accounted for. And in some ways it had been inoculized. I mean, it basically, or not, it had been rendered, inoculate. So it basically had been, considered to be this sort of just passive background. Like, oh, Rome allowed for, it built roads. So that allowed for Christian missionaries to, move around more. This is later after Jesus' death, that kind of thing. And then it really ignored the fact that like Roman centurions would like march, it would put down a protest, say, over people's economic poverty and misery, by crucifying hundreds of adults. I mean, it was really an ugly, brutal context. So the Third Quest produced certain scholars who were particularly sensitive to that, and who then really started to think, maybe these teachings that Jesus had aren't simply him being this dehistoricized, decontextualized sage who doesn't live anywhere, and whose teachings are universal. And his teachings are universal. Like there's a universal element that we can find in his teachings as well as many other, religious teachers throughout the ages. But emphasizing that and thinking that it's only universal takes away from the fact that it was actually very particular, and that probably some of the stuff that he's saying is pretty antagonistic to the Roman Empire and to the political context that he's in. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on in the next video. So I hope that you tune in for that. And if you are tuning into this class and are interested in learning more about what our congregation offers, I encourage you to go to nsuc.org, take a look at our congregation. I'm always offering interesting classes. Well, I think they're interesting, and I know some others agree, but classes on different interesting topics, maybe that's a better way to put it, and lots of different activities and ways to get involved. So I encourage you to take a look at that. I'll see you in the next video.